Right, one thing about George Galloway is the man is no stranger to controversy. In 1994, after the first Gulf War, Galloway had this to say to Saddam Hussein.
Sir, I salute your courage, your strength, your indefatigability.
Galloway said he was referring to the Iraqi people, not Saddam. Then in 2003, Galloway tore into George W. Bush and Tony Blair, saying they attacked Iraq like wolves. That got him kicked out of Blair's Labour Party. More recently, Galloway got into it with our federal government. Back in 2009, he was supposed to come to Canada to speak about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But Ottawa accused him of supporting terrorism, saying he provided financial support to Hamas.
Here is the money!
Galloway says he never gave money directly to Hamas. He said he donated aid for the Palestinian people in Gaza. Either way, Ottawa considers Hamas a terrorist group, so it banned Galloway from entering Canada. The fight ended up in court, and a Canadian judge said the decision was politically motivated, so Galloway was allowed in this past October. But he didn't come quietly. He said he's going to sue the government for branding him a terrorist. In fact, he says that allegation may have been a reason he lost his seat in the British Parliament after nearly 25 years. Oh, and Galloway's cross-Canada speaking tour, well, that's back on too. It's called Free Palestine, Free Afghanistan, Free Speech.
Everybody, please say hello to George Galloway. Nice to see you.
How are you? Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Welcome back to the program. You're
Thanks. Good to be here in person.
In the flesh.
Yes.
Did you ever think you'd make your way back to this country?
I did. I was confident because I knew that Canada ultimately was a country governed by laws rather than by the whim of here today, gone tomorrow politicians.
Now, let's just, are you going to sue this government? You had talked about it.
Yes, on at least two fronts.
Yep.
One abusive process of which I and the people who organised my tour were victims. And a second, which the judge has already found on, that the Canadian government abused my right to privacy under Canadian law by leaking to Rupert Murdoch's Sun newspaper the decision that they had made before they told me.
Now, as a taxpayer, you know when you sue this government, you're suing all of us.
Yes, I know. They've cost the Canadian taxpayer a pretty penny with this affair. It took 6 months of judicial process, a 60-page judgment by the High Court judge, and all of that costs money. However, anything I do win, I'm going to spend here in Canada on building an anti-war movement even bigger than the one that already exists. So at least it won't be leaving the country.
Well, what do you make of the last little while, you know, your experiences here? Like, what do you make of it?
It was Kafkaesque to deliver ambulances and wheelchairs and medicine and to pay the nurses and the doctors in the Gaza hospitals and to have that thrown at you as terrorism bankrupts the word of all meaning in the language. If you're going to describe that as terrorism, then what word are you going to use to describe real terrorism?
But what do you do in a situation where a democratically elected government, and it wasn't this government that declared Hamas a terrorist organization, it's been previous governments as well from different parties. So when a democratically elected, two democratically elected governments have declared Hamas a terrorist organization, now they're not declared that in Britain, but they are in Canada. How do you, like, the country has laws and rules, and this is what this country said, so you can see why they would say that you are giving money to an organization that has been declared to be a terrorist.
Yes, but I didn't give money to a terrorist organization, even if I accepted.
Hamas, right?
No, I gave money to the Ministry of Health, and the Ministry of Health happens to be governed by Hamas because they won the election. So that's what everybody does. If Oxfam goes to Gaza, they have to deal through the Minister of Health, and the Minister of Health is in Hamas. So you can't pick and choose other people's leaders. I'm not a supporter of Hamas. I was disappointed when they won the election. And if I had a vote, it wouldn't be for them. But I can't choose the Palestinian leadership any more than I can choose the Canadian leadership. If I could, I'd change both of them. But there you go.
What would you do now that you're out of politics? I mean, how do you feel about that?
Well, I'm not out of politics.
You're not sitting in your
I'm not in the House of Commons after nearly a quarter of a century, but that just means I'm going around other people's countries as well as my own, speaking my mind. I've got 2 TV shows, 2 radio shows, a newspaper column. So I'm in as much political activity as ever before, and I can reveal I'm going to run again for the Scottish Parliament in just a few months' time.
Back to your roots.
In May, back to my roots in Glasgow.
Your TV show, you interviewed Ahmadinejad.
I did.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's another complicated relationship. I think a lot of people look at Ahmadinejad like he's in no way, shape, or form a democratic leader.
Well, he was democratically elected, unlike all the other leaders in that region who are kings, never get elected at all, and absolute potentates. But he's not my kind of guy. But then I'm not Iranian. He's not my leader. He was...
You expressed support for him, didn't you, on the show?
No,
I think
on the contrary. On my show, I have live on Iranian TV at least 5 times criticized and even condemned. I condemned, for example, their revisionism over the Holocaust. Yeah. I did that live on television. I criticized the way they handled the post-election situation in Tehran. And I'm allowed to do that because they know that if they tried to stop me saying what I wanted to say, I would walk. I wouldn't allow anybody to tell me what to say on television.
But, I'm just curious what your definition of a just politician is. Because Ahmadinejad is the guy who declares there's no homosexuals in Iran. He is clear. He has talked about, when you talk about condemning their view on the Holocaust, this is his thing, wiping Israel off the map. This is what he declares. So how can you?
I think there's, I mean, with respect, it's lost a bit in translation. He didn't say there were no gays in Iran. He said we don't have the same kind of gay problem in Iran, and he regards gays as problem. Whereas me, I spend my life surrounded by gays, so he and I are never going to agree with that, on that. But
is there a moment where you have to say that clearly a lot of his values are not in line with yours, and that that's not a democratic elected leader that you should support?
All I'm saying is let's not have a war with Iran. We've already got enough wars going on, and everything else, at least we can debate and discuss and negotiate, and if we end up not being friends with somebody, that's fine too. But we don't have to go to war, and I just feel that we're marching down a road which ends in war with Iran, just like the road that we marched down over Iraq, and what a disaster that's turned out to be.
When did this happen to you? When did you realize that this was going to be an important issue for you? You were clearly young, but can you pinpoint a moment?
Exactly, yeah, midsummer, almost Midsummer's Day in 1975. So 35 years ago.
So the Rolling Stones were on the big tour,
yeah,
the last great rock and roll tour,
as they still are.
Yeah.
And I was in the Labour Party office in Dundee. I was a teenage member of the Labour Party at the age of 13. I was there, 75, so I was 21 years old, and a Palestinian student came to the door of the office. He asked to speak to the leaders. I said, there's no leaders here, but you can talk to me. I'll talk to them. And over 2 hours, he spoke to me about the Palestinian tragedy in a way which absolutely captured me. And I decided there and then that this was something I was going to get involved in. And it's changed my life. I mean, 35 years on this subject. I wasn't to know that it would still be as central an issue in 2010 as it was in 1975. But that's the way it's turned out to be, which means that I'm a specialist in an area that the whole world is interested in all the time.
One of the big charges against you is that if it's not you, it's the people that you align yourself with, or at the very least are seen to align yourself with, help contribute to anti-Semitism. How do you feel about that?
Well, for someone like me who's spent a life on the left, it's a ludicrous charge, because anti-Semitism is racism, not just racism, but the most poisonous strain of racism, in that it systematically set out to murder an entire people in the 1930s and 40s in Christian Europe. To somehow lay at the door of a lifelong anti-racist, racist ideas and thoughts, which have never crossed my mind. No racist idea has ever been in my mind. No racist word has ever crossed my lips. No one could ever produce any such thing. Because I, into my bones, am an anti-racist. I'm on every anti-racist manifestation, demonstration. It oozes from me in everything that I believe. So I just regard it at best as a foolish nonsense, but at worst a deliberate diversion to try to turn people away from the real facts.
You, much of what you do is talk about democracy and how much you value democracy. And I wonder, for a guy who's been a politician for a long time and been elected many times, when democracy didn't end up in your favor, when you lost the election, what does that mean to you, that moment?
Well, I had been elected 5 times, including the first time in 60 years that anyone from the left of Labour got elected to a parliamentary seat in England, so I'd had a good record. I moved to another riding to try and test it out for the 6th time, It was always a long shot, and it didn't come off. I did it actually to relieve pressure on another seat and another one up in the Midlands where we hope to win. But I'm missing it, and so I'm going to try again in May to be elected this time for the Scottish Parliament. In the interim, Labour has chosen a new leader, a leader who agrees with me about the war in Iraq, who opposed it, would have voted against it if he'd been in Parliament at the time. But he was probably in short trousers, I don't know. But he is saying the same things about Iraq as I did. So the possibility exists, of course, that I'll end up back in the Labour Party, which I joined back when I was 13.
Is that going to feel, well, we'll find out if that feels weird to him. Also, I want to find out what Mr. Galloway respects about George Bush and Tony Blair. More with George Galloway when we come back. You're back here with George Galloway on the program. You like a good fight, right?
I was a boxer.
Yeah. Were you a good boxer?
I was not bad. My maternal grandfather was a pretty legendary boxing trainer.
Is that where you learned to be so scrappy?
Well, I always take the view that if someone hits me, it's my right, my duty to hit them back. But I never...
It's not a very left-wing policy.
No, it's not. Turning the other cheek's never been my idea of fun.
Eventually you just run out of cheeks, don't you? When you were... many people on the left don't get into politics, per se. They work in a different... either underground or in grassroots or whatever. Were you frustrated? Because at a certain point you must have looked around and realized that you were... not a lone voice, but almost a lone voice, even in your own government.
Well, I was a lone voice inside the Parliament, or almost a lone voice in the Parliament, but outside there were millions massing. And this disconnect between the street and the Parliament, I described it as the boys in the bubble. The politicians were in a bubble. They got carried away in a kind of mass hysteria about Iraq. They believed the propaganda, their own propaganda. It was entirely circular.
Were you ever frustrated by the limitations of politics?
Well, I never was one who believed that politics was only about Parliament. I was always a person trying to build mass movements, trying to give leadership to mass movements. So I always operated on two levels. And by the time the war came, our mass movement was millions strong in England and, of course, echoed across the world in millions.
If you didn't do this, if politics wasn't your calling, what would you be doing?
Well, they say that politics is show business for ugly people. What would I know about that?
What's the one thing you respect about George Bush? And don't say he's a good father, because that's a cop-out. So what's the one thing you respect about George W. Bush?
To be honest with you, I'd be struggling, even as a Christian, to find a kind word to say about him. I think he was an imbecile. I think that Tony Blair didn't have the alibi he had of being stupid. So I blame Blair more than I do Bush.
What's the good thing about Tony Blair? You must know him better.
I know him very well, you know, whilst most people thought George Bush couldn't read a book, never mind write one, no one's surprised that Tony Blair can write a book and that it's a big seller because he's always had a way with words. He was an election winner. It's good to be an election winner. He was a modernizing force in British Labour politics, and it needed modernizing. But it's one thing modernizing the cover of the Bible, but when you start rewriting the Bible therein, that's sacrilege. And that's, I think, what he did.
What's the most important thing you learned from your folks?
Not to drink alcohol, which I've never tasted in my life, which means I'm up in the morning with a spring that not many politicians of my vintage can say, and to always stand with the underdog. I always have. Even in a football match or a hockey match, I'm with the team that's getting humped by 30 points. Yeah, always.
So you're not much of a gambler, then either, are you?
St. Jude is my saint, the saint of hopeless causes.
Good to see you, man. George Galloway, everybody. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming out. All right, strongbow.com is the website. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.